Tony and Joyce, thank you so much for joining us. Really excited to have you. Can you just start off by introducing yourselves for listeners? Give us your name and the work that you do.
Hi, my name is Joyce Soyhun Lee. I work for the visual forensics team at the Washington Post, and our team really focuses on visually driven investigations.
And I'm Tony Wilson. I'm the founder and director of the Security Force Monitor, which is a project of the Human Rights Institute at Columbia Law School. And our project, the Security Force Monitor, focuses on using publicly available information to understand the structure, the commanders, and the operations of police and military forces around the world, with the goal of having that information be useful to journalists, human rights researchers, and others concerned with the conduct of these forces.
Great. And before we dive into your research, I want to start by putting this research in context. Can you describe what the war has looked like in the last few years, what we know about civilian harm trends in Yemen, and what the U.S. role has been?
Sure. Maybe I'll start off just as a way of background, on March 26, 2015, a coalition of 9 countries led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates launched an airstrike campaign and later a ground invasion campaign in Yemen, with the goal of defeating the armed group Ansar Allah, also called the Houthis, which at the time controlled northern Yemen and had proceeded into the south and had seized control of southern Yemen as well. Since the beginning, since day one, human rights groups have been raising concern about the conduct of coalition operations, in particular the airstrike campaign. Actually, the first recorded airstrike that human rights groups raised concerns about was on day one, was on March 26, 2015. And that continued going forward as human rights groups recorded strikes on other things that they classified as civilian objects, be it residential homes, factories that produce beverages like milk and other things, funeral halls, schools, and other things that, according to the groups, as they documented them, should not have been struck by the coalition, that they were not military targets or not appropriate targets to be struck by the coalition. At the same time, these countries are huge recipients of U.S. security assistance, from training, sales of weapons, planes, and other equipment, and that trend continued through the war as well.
Yeah, I think that Tony covered that incredibly well. The only thing I would add is that the conflict has led to one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Hundreds of thousands of people have died from fighting or indirect consequences like hunger. And conservative estimates put that, civilian deaths from the air campaign alone is somewhere around 9,000. And again, I would emphasize that is a conservative estimate. So the toll of this Saudi-led coalition intervention in Yemen and the civil war has just been devastating.
And what made you undertake this particular investigation? How did you start? What did the research look like?
Yeah. Really, the research started from where we were able to support human rights groups like Mawatana and others who are doing really critical on-the-ground investigations of the airstrikes and their consequences. Obviously, we're not going to be able to do on-the-ground research. There's so many constraints for groups even based in the country and threats and other things that they have to overcome. But what quickly became clear as a question that we could really tackle was this uncertainty around what the coalition was. Everyone said, okay, the coalition, it's these 9 countries, coalition, but it's like, what does that mean? And for the Monitor, we know from other countries and other contexts that when a major operation like this occurs, the militaries of the countries just take units that they have and deploy them. There's not some other like reserve force. There's not time to create new units specially trained for this operation. They take what they have and they go. And so what we did is we started with what the coalition said about itself. And when the war started on March 26, 2015, there was a lot of announcements about this country sent this, Bahrain sent F-16s, Saudi sent F-15s, other countries sent other types of planes, and that gave us a hook of where to start the research. So what we did is I went and documented, okay, what are all the air forces of these countries, the entire Air Force? What are all the units? What do they fly? And then from there, to take those first kind of glimpses into the air campaign to say, like, okay, well, if this source is saying Bahrain sent F-16s, if I know everything about the Air Force from public sources, what units fly F-16s? And conversely, what units don't fly F-16s? Which units, we don't have any evidence of them serving in Yemen. We kind of went down the line country by country. And the key there for air forces is this term that I'll use again and again and again, is squadrons, which are the main fighting unit of an air force that's from 8 to 24 planes. It's kind of a range, but they generally have one role or a main role. So they're a transport squadron. They fly planes that transport stuff. They're not designed, and their mission isn't to go bomb things. If they're an airstrike squadron, their mission is to conduct airstrikes. If they're like an interceptor squadron, their mission is to shoot down other planes, not to do airstrikes. It's to shoot down other planes. And so having all of that information together allowed us to understand, okay, not only these are the squadrons that we should be concerned about, but these are the squadrons we should be concerned about not only for their planes, but because they can conduct airstrikes. And really, that took a variety of sources from very useful books from Anthony Kordsman and Tim Ripley, supplemented with media reports from Arabian Aerospace and Air Force Monthly, and plane watching sites like Scramble and F16.net. From there, it was a question of, okay, we have a good sense of the air forces and what units could have served. We know more about them. How do we track U.S. security assistance to these forces? And the good news is the U.S. is comparatively fairly transparent. It makes a lot of announcements of things. The bad news is, to understand it, you've got to go through every daily announcement of the DoD's website, read through it, say, okay, what are they selling today? What's been approved? Could this go to one of the countries we're concerned about? If it does, could it go to one of the units we're concerned about? And so that's what we did, is just dug through all of those reports and all those press releases to see what contracts had equipment, planes, weapons, other things that an F-16 from Bahrain would have used, or an F-15 from Saudi, or an F-16 from United Arab Emirates would have used. And that was the way we understood, okay, this contract could have gone to these squadrons because they fly that type of plane. And finally, the last thing we looked at was, what are the allegations actually been made against the coalition, against the air campaign? And so reading through the various human rights reports to pull together a list of over 300 airstrikes that they had raised concerns about, that they had alleged either were potential violations, were violations of international humanitarian law, or potentially were war crimes. And just to flag, again, doing on-the-ground work and documentation in Yemen is incredibly, incredibly challenging. And so there are certainly other strikes that groups were concerned about, but were not able to document, and thus could not say, okay, this is a violation, or we're concerned this is a violation. They simply could not access the site. So that's a very low number given the war in Yemen, but it's still deeply, deeply concerning.
I think that sort of covers it. For us at the Post, Tony's body of work was so incredible and thoroughly researched. And my colleagues and I thought smart that, and Tony had brought this up as well, that there was a lot of opportunity for us to really dig into the visual material that's been released by the coalition countries and the US government itself, to give us some data points that aren't immediately obvious in contracting language or in the military structure. But, I think Tony has covered really the breadth and depth of the project.
Well, I'll just add one plug for the always modest Joyce and her team, which was going through and trying to find out this question about who had been trained, which unfortunately is a lot less transparent, and involved her and her colleagues going through various sites that had pictures of planes serving in trainings and seeing the tail numbers and country flags for them, and being able to tie that to specific squadrons so that they could understand, okay, from the contract side, maybe these planes had been serviced by the U.S. or been sold by the U.S. to these squadrons, but also here's concrete proof of this tail number belongs to a particular type of plane from this squadron, and if it's being pictured flying at a U.S. base for training, that means that squadron was trained by the U.S.
And this is so interesting because, the Pentagon has often said that it's difficult to pinpoint which units in foreign militaries are actually receiving U.S. equipment because U.S. equipment, can be moved around. But what you're saying is that the research that both of you have done has found that the specific squadrons receiving U.S. support is actually completely knowable information, and with open source information, no less.
That's exactly right. That even with all of the concerns being raised and all the potentials for all of these airstrikes, at the end of the day, we found if you only know the types of planes that countries sent, that's 39 squadrons that could have done the airstrikes in Yemen. That's it. And from there, we were able to find publicly available information to confirm 19 of those squadrons did serve in Yemen. And it's ultimately very, very knowable. Actually, they all have a great, Joyce and her team wrote a great line in the story, which I want to quote, which is, "The universe of squadrons carrying out airstrikes is a narrow and knowable one."
Yeah. No, go ahead, Joyce.
I think that was also just a big realization for us, is that, and I think Tony spoke to this earlier, but, the sense of the airstrikes being attributed broadly to the coalition, and the various air forces inside of it, and the sense that, we won't be able to know which plane carried it out, which squadron carried it out, because it's just a big amorphous blob. But that's so far from the truth. It's actually quite, accessible information. It took us a while to do the reporting, obviously, but it's knowable. We know we have, a finite list of squadrons that carried out these airstrikes. We have videos and images of them at the air bases, either taking off or landing after airstrikes. And, we know a good deal about each of these squadrons, thanks to Tony's incredible work. And so this sort of what felt meaningful for us about this project, sort of chipping away at the solution that this is too large to know when it's really not.
Yeah. And
no,
go ahead.
Just to add too, to get down in the weeds a little bit, the implications of what squadrons served is also very huge for U.S. policy, because for many countries of the coalition, every squadron flying a particular type of plane served. So there's really no way to touch that plane with contracts. That a type of plane for these countries that can't go to a squadron that serves. So to put it another way, every F-16 squadron from Bahrain and United Arab Emirates served. So therefore, if you're doing a contract that's supporting F-16s for either of those countries, all the squadrons served in Yemen. There's no way to support an F-16 and not run the risk that you're supporting an airstrike squadron that served in Yemen and thus might be connected to an airstrike that groups have said is a potential war crime or a violation of international humanitarian law. It's the same thing for Saudi with the F-15 fleet, same thing for Kuwait with their F-18s. So it's really the implications of, again, just open source research that we were able to pull together is really, really troubling. And we don't have the resources of the U.S. government to understand what's going on. It's just our small little team. So that's also very troubling.
And I actually want to ask you a little bit more about that. How did your findings line up with what we know about civilian casualties in Yemen, including possible war crimes? In other words, did you find that U.S. support was linked to airstrikes that may have been war crimes?
So we weren't able, so being able to link a specific squadron to an airstrike, is not something that we were able to do ultimately, and it's not for a lack of trying. I think that there's, as we discussed before, usually when an airstrike occurs, even when the coalition says that they're going to investigate one of their own airstrikes, they'll still say this was carried out by the coalition without any kind of specifics about the squadron that was involved. And, I think that we found that detail to be exceedingly difficult to know. But what we do know is that the Saudi-led coalition maintains a master database of each airstrike. And they also, in that database, detailed the squadron and the type of munition that was used. And we also know, according to U.S. officials, that both American and British personnel that were stationed in Riyadh at the coalition headquarters had access to this database at some point during the war, meaning that Tony and I might not know, but in theory, American and British officials should have known, or at one point knew, at a certain point, which squadron carried out which airstrike. And potentially might have known which squadron carried out airstrikes that violated or appeared to violate the rules of war. And again, so the Washington Post did file a Freedom of Information Act request for this database, but the U.S. Air Force declined it, saying that they didn't have the records. But for us, knowing that this knowledge is out there, that this is something that is, in theory, U.S. officials had access to, was a crucial point for us that came up.
So what I'm hearing from you is that your research wasn't able to make that exact connection because of the information available. But, and I was struck by actually a quote from Tony in your piece that there's virtually, based on what you found, virtually no way for the U.S. or other countries to support these squadrons without supporting squadrons that may be linked to war crimes and other violations.
That's correct. There's really no way to be supporting these squadrons and not run that risk of supporting a squadron that's potentially committed a war crime.
Yeah.
I'll just say, one thing going into this is again into the weeds a little bit, but so what we did is we looked at the 7-year period from when the war started to the 7-year anniversary of the war to see what the U.S. Had supplied and supported during that time period. And so there's as many as 94 contracts that the U.S. approved that went to airstrike squadrons for the Emirates and for Saudi Arabia. And this is out of more than 200 contracts across all the coalition countries that were approved that would probably benefit airstrike squadrons that could have or did serve in Yemen. And when I say probably benefited, what I mean is that the U.S. contracting isn't specific to say this squadron is getting this thing, but the type of plane or the weapon or the equipment that is in that contract We have sources saying is for a particular type of plane, for the F-16 from the Emirates, and thus the Emirates has 3 squadrons of fly F-16s. All of them potentially probably benefited from this. We can't say it's this one versus that one necessarily, so we just tag them all as probably benefited. But across all the countries, we're talking about, when we're concerned about a plane that could have served in Yemen, a type of plane, there's only 2 or 3 squadrons that fly that type of plane in each country. So at a certain point, if you're sending so many contracts to the country, it kind of boggles the mind that it would only go to one squadron, not the other. And for most, like Bahrain, like Kuwait, like Saudi, like the Emirates, it doesn't matter because all of the squadrons flying a type of plane serve. So if you only supported one of those squadrons, one of those 3, one of those 2, that squadron served in Yemen.
Overwhelmingly, so much of the coalition, they're flying American equipment and using American weaponry. And it's really, I think it's worth sort of keeping that in mind, that, at the end of the day, we've gotten really into the specifics, but the top line is that, like, the majority of these squadrons couldn't fly or even exist without American fighter jets and planes and American personnel on the ground helping these planes get off the ground.
And, given that reality, the U.S. has faced quite a bit of pressure around its role in civilian harm in Yemen. What do we know about how the U.S. government has addressed these concerns over the last few years, or tried to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we know from, and Tony nodded to this as well, that pretty much from day one, there were significant concerns about whether coalition airstrikes may have violated the rules of law. And we know that, there are these internal State Department discussions around it as well, because of documents of emails that were released as part of a Freedom of Information Act request by Reuters. And the United States took a couple of steps to mitigate these civilian harm risks. The first is that they sent advisors to the coalition headquarters to advise on civilian harm reduction tactics. Additionally, for the Saudi Air Force, they provided civilian casualty, law of armed conflict, and human rights trainings as part of their foreign military sales package to the Saudi Air Force. And in 2019, the U.S. also adopted a policy that required that precision-guided missiles have to be sold with appropriate targeting infrastructure. And I think one concern that really piqued our interest in the topic is concerns about whether any U.S. officials might be sort of vulnerable to charges of aiding and abetting war crimes under international law. I am not a lawyer, but having spoken with a couple of really, a few brilliant lawyers for the story, we learned that war crimes and aiding and abetting have different standards in different courts, including domestic ones. But one standard that we came to again and again is that individuals or a state might be found guilty of aiding and abetting if they continue to provide assistance to a problematic actor with knowledge that their support would contribute to future crimes and despite assurances. That is sort of important to keep in mind. And moreover, the GAO publicly released a report in June that basically found that the DoD and state had not properly investigated which U.S. support contributed to civilian harm, despite reports of extensive civilian harm in Yemen.
And I'll just add, from the contracting side, even while these concerns were being raised, over that 7-year period, every U.S. administration approved contracts that probably benefited airstrike squadrons serving in Yemen. Obama and Trump and Biden administrations all approved contracts that went to the various coalition countries and had planes, equipment or weapons that would go to, that we only have sources that could have benefited airstrike squadrons.
So then in 2021, the Biden administration announced that it would end U.S. support for what they deemed offensive operations carried out by the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. And I'm curious, if, in terms of your research, did you find that distinction held? Was there assistance continuing to support these squadrons?
Right. So I think the distinction that they're making is on offensive weapons. So let's say the bomb that you would actually use to carry out the airstrike, which they haven't sold, as at least as far as the contracts that we looked at. However, the issue is, sure, you're not selling the bomb that's being put on the plane, but if you're still selling the plane or servicing the plane or putting new equipment into the plane that's then carrying out these strikes, that's not a very good distinction, and that's not really that much of a limitation, it seems like. You're still running the risk of supporting a plane, supporting a squadron that is potentially linked to an airstrike that is a potential war crime. And also, the number of squadrons doesn't really change. So even if you come in and, let's say, hypothetically, there were no airstrikes that were potential war crimes or violations under Biden, even though that's not the case. Even if it was, that squadron is still the same one that, in past administrations potentially did that thing that for which there's no accountability for those strikes that they potentially did. And if you're servicing that plane, if you're selling that squadron new planes, that's very concerning. That raises a lot of troubling questions.
Yeah, and I would just add that the State Department hasn't provided really clear or a clear definition of what they mean by offensive versus defensive. And I think that the line between the two, as Tony just went over, is quite blurry, and I think is depending on who you speak to, it could swing one way or the other. And so when President Biden took office and pretty much immediately after announced the end of offensive support and paused sales to Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis pending review. Despite this pause, the maintenance contracts that Tony just alluded to weren't impacted. Those were still ongoing, and were helping keep these Air Force squadrons ready to fly and helping these planes stay in good shape. Which that has now come under sharp criticism from members of Congress. And the other side of this is that the U.S. has moved forward in recent, months or years, has moved forward under the Biden administration with arms sales to the Saudis and the Emiratis, what they call defensive weapons. To the Saudis, they've sold. The State Department has approved a sale of hundreds of millions of air-to-air missiles to the Saudi Arabia, and then for the UAE, a tens of $1 million sale to booster the country's missile defense systems, sort of with the justification that these are important. These are important to help the two countries defend their borders, especially against Houthi attacks from Yemen. So all this to say, the support continues, whether it's defensive or offensive. I think is not a question for me to determine or for us. But it is a blurry line, and that was something that we sort of ran up against as we tried to ask the State Department: is what is offensive, what is defensive, what falls under which, and that's been a really difficult question, I think, to answer.
And why do you think, in light of these really well-documented civilian harm and human rights risks, why do you think so much of this support that you investigated continued, and some of it, as you just mentioned, has continued?
Yeah, so we came across two points to that. The first is Leahy vetting, which the Leahy law is about the statute that essentially says, the United States cannot provide security assistance to units of foreign militaries that are implicated in a gross violation of human rights. But under the current interpretation, that the Leahy law vetting only kicks in when that security assistance is paid for by the United States. And so countries like the Saudis and the Emiratis that pay for their own assistance are not subject to Leahy vetting. And then the other factor that we learned about is just that there is the sheer volume of contracts overwhelms human rights concerns in the vetting process. And I'm sure, Annie, you're well aware of this. But, when, we were sent, the House Democrats wrote a letter to a subcommittee back in April. And just to quote them, they said that the staffing constraints that meant that over the course of the year, the State Department was expected to complete an analysis on the human rights risks associated with a weapons export license every 5 minutes, which is an impossible task, really. But it really brings to mind that it's not just, the sales that we hear about for military sales that are over a certain threshold. There's also direct commercial sales and this whole other universe of sales that, the public doesn't really have any insight to, and that the sheer volume of contracts is really much larger than, we know and that we were able to review for this project. Not because we didn't want to, but because that information isn't public.
I want to close by asking you, I'm curious about what was most surprising to you in doing this investigation, and also, what are your biggest kind of takeaways, or what do you see as the biggest implications moving forward?
The biggest surprise, well, there's actually a couple. I would say from my side, one of the more depressing things actually was it took us a while to pull together all of the sources. That's not depressing. It just took the time. But what was quite depressing was once we got them all together and understood what they were telling us and all of that, by late 2015, you could have mapped out the coalition from open sources. If that was literally the only things you had, you could have done it. You could have understood. And so that means the U.S. government could have understood who was serving in the coalition and what the concerns were. Simply, if they did have access to the same sources we were looking at, with obviously vastly more resources. I think the second thing, thinking of civilian protection concerns and the questions that this raises for U.S. policy is. Again, we only looked at contracts for that 7-year period, but those contracts are still going. The latest ones through like 2029. So these questions are for this administration, but future administrations. And finally, the implications for any one sale can really reverberate through time. So the planes that we're raising concerns about that are attacking Yemen, or that may be potentially involved in war crimes, these were sold by the George H.W. Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the W. Bush administration. And so when these sales happen, what are the implications of it 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, 20 years down the line? Like, that's the real concern, is once they're sold, they're sold.
I think that's such a great point. And when you look on Scramble and you look up the planes and these squadrons, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Tony, but I believe they're like the old tail numbers or detail. And, the way they're labeled before they're given to a country is it'll say like the year. So for example, like 93-TK number. 93 tells us that was the year, for example, that plane was manufactured and sent. And they're still in use. So I think, to Tony's point, like, these contracts just have really long tails. And that in Yemen there have been the remnants of bombs that have been found that were sold in the 90s. There's just they keep them in the arsenal, and it's there, and it's not just they have a long shelf life, essentially. I think the biggest challenge for us, unsurprisingly, is that this is such a complicated universe to learn about, complicated laws, just a myriad of government agencies, and offices within the Department of State, and the Defense Department, and the DoD, and just a number of, I guess, perhaps, I don't want to say barriers, but challenges towards transparency and accountability. And that feels, concerning given just the amount of money that's involved in this, the number of countries that the US is selling and supporting. And, what raised important questions for us about how we can have accountability and transparency into a really lucrative, industry that does have very real impact abroad and especially in Yemen. And that continues to be a challenge for us.
And that's such an important point because, if this universe is difficult for, the people on this call to understand, for researchers and journalists and, advocates who are dedicated to understanding this issue, then for an issue of such scale and importance to our foreign policy, it's so hard for any members of the public to really understand if they're not really focused on it. And even then, as you mentioned, it's a really complicated issue. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll just add to all of the barriers and transparency that Joyce mentioned are very, very high for the US. They're even higher for European countries. So we have some semblance of what the US has done in supporting these countries. For Europe, it's much more of a black box.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. It was an absolute pleasure. And of course, if there's anything else you all want to make sure you cover that we didn't get to, please, now is the time. So
there is one thing I definitely should have done and didn't. Just as far as the research, the research was really aided by a researcher at Mawatana, who I worked with extensively over the course of more than a year, training them in security force monitors methodology, but then really relying on them to dig through Arabic language sources to find material related to this question about the coalition. And that was really instrumental to the success of this project and the ultimate kind of outcomes. So it was quite a privilege and honor to be able to work with them on that.
If we're doing shout outs, working with Tony and Priyanka at the Security Force Monitor was truly just, a delight in a lot of ways, but also to see like the detailed and thorough work that Tony does. And, it's like if it takes someone like Tony, who's dedicated and well-versed in this world, so many months and hours to accumulate this like really this data set, then I think it speaks to the challenges for the rest of us to know which to know sort of like the extent of U.S. involvement in conflicts abroad. It's been a fascinating project.